It was announced just a little over a week ago that Walt Disney would be reviving the short-lived science fiction television series Firefly as an animated series featuring the original cast. The show, which will feature a reunion of all surviving cast members, is reportedly in early development at 20th Century Animation, the animation division of the studio formerly known as Fox. Created by Joss Whedon at the height of his powers, during the final season of Buffy the Vampire Slayer and the penultimate season of Angel, Firefly was a space western, following Captain Malcolm Mal Reynolds and his unlikely crew of misfits aboard their ship Serenity. The show consists of one 2-hour pilot and then a full half-season order of 13 episodes, but it was cancelled by Fox after only 11 of the 14 had aired. The show was well regarded, spawning a vocal fan campaign to resurrect it, known as the Browncoats. Viewers appealed to UPN to pick it up, which failed. However, the support for Firefly did manage to convince Universal to agree to produce a feature film, Serenity. The film, which released in September 2005 and was well received, was also a financial disappointment. As such, it seemed like Firefly was dead. It seemed destined to remain a well-loved curio in the gone-before-its-time annals of television history. Joss Whedon went on to produce shows like Dollhouse and The Nevers, which failed to capture the zeitgeist in the same way that Buffy the Vampire Slayer had. He went on to direct The Avengers and Avengers Age of Ultron, with the latter having an extremely troubled production. Whedon himself became a source of controversy when a number of his past collaborators spoke about his abusive behavior on set, which his subsequent interviews did very little to help, and honestly seems to have stalled his career. However, because we live in the timeline that we do, where nothing ever actually ends, the show is destined to be revived. So this week, we're going to talk about that inevitable revival. We're going to discuss why the show is being revived now, the potential issues with pulling a piece of pop culture from its point of origin 20 years ago into the present, and why maybe it's okay for things to end. Aside from that, let's get all fired up. The resurrection of Firefly in some ways feels inevitable. Following their purchase of Fox, the Walt Disney Corporation has begun strip mining the company's library of intellectual property for parts. Obviously, they're planning to fold the X-Men franchise into their larger Marvel Cinematic Universe, a project that began in earnest with Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, and which carried through Ms. Marvel and Deadpool and Wolverine. While it initially seemed that they might be destined for streaming, the Alien and Predator franchises have demonstrated their value to Disney as theatrical and cable properties, with recent high-profile releases like Alien Romulus, Alien Earth, and Predator Badlands. However, it does seem like the rest of the Fox library is destined to be grist for the streaming service mill, given that Disney have recently determined that their live-action Marvel and Star Wars properties are too valuable to fill that role. The trend is already in effect. Ryan Coogler is working on an X-Files reboot. Chloe Zhao was working on a Buffy the Vampire Slayer reboot, but it was cancelled over the same weekend that the Firefly revival was announced. There is a Malcolm in the Middle reboot coming. All of these properties are, or were, aimed at the company's streaming output, rather than at cable television, linear television, or theatrical distribution. The idea is to plug gaps in the streaming infrastructure left by pivoting projects like Freakier Friday, Moana 2, or the live-action Lilo and Stitch reboot that were originally intended for streaming back to theaters. There is something exhaustingly cynical in all this, in the ruthless and unending exploitation of any intellectual property, no matter how fringe or marginal. And look, I try not to directly insert myself into these video essays too often, but given the arguments that I'm about to make, it is worth stressing that I make them as a big fan of Firefly, as somebody who thinks that the show never got the respect that it deserved, and that it was cancelled far too early by a network that didn't understand what it had. I love Firefly. That's why I don't want it to come back. Maybe it's okay for things to end. Maybe it's good for properties to run their course. Maybe it's ideal for television shows to wrap up. Not everything needs to be constantly recycled and regurgitated, rehashed and replayed to cash in on nostalgia by pandering to those fans who loved it in the first place. Maybe it's enough for those objects to stand as complete monuments, even those projects that ended too soon. This is a broader comment about the state of pop culture, which is haunted by unending zombie franchises that just keep shuffling awkwardly around. On a long enough curve, everything gets a reboot, a revival, a prequel, a remake, or some strange unlikely resurrection. More often than not, this resurrection becomes uncanny. This is in part because the talent have either aged or changed from where they were in their lives when the property hit.
Some of the baddest motherfuckers on the planet are on that plane, all craving action. Whatever you want to wager on, the money plane has you covered. You want to bet on a dude fucking an alligator. Money plane.
But also because the audience has changed as well. For the target demographic of this revival, the audience's memory of watching Firefly is probably watching it as a teenager. It's a cliche, but it's true. You can't go home again, and you can't step in the same river twice. Now, there are a few reasons why Firefly specifically is a bad fit for this sort of revival, both within the text itself and outside it. The show already has a pretty great ending. Serenity is a pretty decent conclusion to the story, and it notably includes some fairly definitive endings for characters like Wash and Book. Then again, given that Serenity was produced by Universal rather than by Fox, Disney have their reasons for wanting to steer viewers away from it. The show will reportedly exist in some weird suspended liminal space between the show and the movie, meaning that it will still theoretically be confined by the contours of a narrative constructed over 20 years ago. All that said, there are bigger causes for concern outside the text itself. The biggest of those is Joss Whedon. This gets into complicated and thorny territory, particularly in an era that seems built around simplistic moral absolutes, where the first impulse on hearing that an artist has done bad things is to reflexively decry their entire body of work as bad. It's an understandable reaction, as we can avoid delving into uncomfortable contradictions if we believe that bad people make bad art and good people make good art. Whedon has certainly made bad art. His hack job replacing Zack Snyder on Justice League resulted in a film that arguably prefigured the larger direction of these sorts of blockbusters in the worst possible ways. Dollhouse was kinda creepy at the time, and knowing what we know now has not aged particularly well. Even Age of Ultron is a fascinating mess of a movie that is overstuffed and awkwardly paced. Whedon is not quite the nerd god that he was proclaimed to be at the height of his powers. However, while all of that is true, Whedon is also a generationally important artist. And while one can certainly read some uncomfortable connections into his body of work, the truth is that a lot of what made Buffy the Vampire Slayer such a success was down to Whedon's artistic sensibilities. As comforting as it might be to be able to cleave Whedon from the work, the truth is that the two are inexorably intertwined. The same is true of Firefly. Whedon is credited on the scripts of 5 of the 14 episodes, and as showrunner he probably did more uncredited rewrites, and he directed the pilot, the first episode after the pilot, and the finale. He also wrote and directed Serenity. Naturally, the show is suffused with his personality and his interests. This is not uniformly a good thing. There are certainly aspects of characters like River Tam which fall into some of the cliches of Whedon's writing, particularly around women. It's a fairly straight line from the idea of the female slayers to River Tam to Dollhouse. However one feels about him, Whedon is inseparable from the project. There are 2 options when resurrecting Firefly. The first is to bring back Whedon, which is obviously unconscionable. There's a reason why Whedon should not be working, and certainly why he should not be placed in an active show-running position. However, the other option is to bring back the show without Whedon, which is the path that the revival has chosen, although Nathan Fillion has stressed that the revival has Whedon's blessing. This is a bad choice for different reasons, reducing the show to a pale imitation of Whedon. Presumably, Whedon is going to get paid for the revival of Firefly. He's going to earn money off a participation deal, and likely a fee for the use of characters and concepts that he created. There is a valid ethical question there about rewarding an abusive artist while they are still alive. More broadly, there's a sense that Firefly is a show of its time. Although set in the future, it is a Western. Pointedly, it's a post-Civil War Western, where the crew of the Serenity fought on the losing side of the war. Although never foregrounded in the narrative, it is effectively a romantic lost cause fiction, just dressed up in science fiction trappings, playing into that fantasy of the Confederate States of America as an oppressed victim of Northern expansion in a way that downplays the real factors involved. If you get what I mean. This wasn't that big a deal in the original context of Firefly. It was not a huge deal at the time for Whedon to, for example, to introduce a bounty hunter played by an African-American performer who shares a name with Confederate general and, quote, bad old man, unquote, Jubal Early. These days, however, culture is perhaps a bit more finely attuned to the appropriation of and use of Confederate iconography in popular American culture. There's also the show's tendency to exoticize East Asian language and culture, with the characters speaking Chinese and making vague allusions to China's influence on this future world, but without featuring any real engagement with the culture itself or involving many characters or actors from that background. It's not necessarily something best suited to be pulled forward into the modern day without careful recalibration. None of this is to criticize Firefly, by the way. The show was, as all art is, a product of its time. The issue is that the strip mining of pop culture history for nostalgia, the cultural fracking of trying to wring every last cent of value from existing intellectual property, is often ill-equipped to deal with that very simple and very straightforward reality. It is no longer 2002, and the challenge in bringing back something like Firefly is that acknowledging that reality would mean changing it fundamentally. The problem with many of these sorts of revivals is that any substantive attempt to update them is inevitably met with strong pushback from those who just want uncritical nostalgia. So these revivals often remain stuck in stasis, a weird not quite then, but not quite now, uncanny valley between past and present, heightened by having 20-year-old cast members play animated versions of their younger selves, dancing between the raindrops of a story that ended 2 decades ago. It's exhausting. Firefly got an ending. It was a premature ending, sure, but Serenity offered a more satisfying conclusion than many long-running shows could hope for. It seems reckless to throw all of that away, gambling on the nostalgia of audiences in the hope of turning back the clock more than 2 decades. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.